All right, guys, as you can see, we are in a series entitled Happily Ever After. Today is actually the conclusion of this series. And so if you're diving in, today is your first week, maybe you've missed the other parts of it, that's okay. It'll still apply today. In fact, if you're in the room and you're not married, this still applies to you as well. The scriptures and the truths and the things that we've been looking at throughout this series, they apply to just peer-to-peer relationships. They apply to workplace relationships. They apply to mother-father, those kind of relationships. They also apply to our relationships with one another, whether we're dating or we're engaged to be married, whether we've been married 1 year or 150 years. The truths that we're looking at in this series have been looking at apply to all of those relationship contexts, okay? And so as we've been going through this series, we've been wrestling with this idea, this tension. In fact, for several weeks of the series, I had a box located next to me today. I have something different here. And we talked about this idea that all of us, when we think about happily ever after, when we think about marriage, we think about relationship, we have a vision in our minds of what it's going to look like. We have hopes, and we have dreams, and we have desires of what we anticipate is going to happen within that relationship. We stood at an altar, if you're married, and you brought that with you. And the tension of that is it actually translates into expectations. And so those expectations, while it seems like a great thing from my vantage point, from the partners, from the spouse's vantage point, it feels like expectations. It feels like a burden. It's heavy. And then we expect them. We push it on them. It's their responsibility to make our hopes, dreams, and desires come true. And so in week one, we talked about that tension and that expectation a lot. And so in part one, we talked about the idea that when we have those expectations, we really ultimately, it boils down to this idea that we have to realize that you owe each other everything, but you're owed nothing in return. We talked about this a lot. And so in part two of this, we took it a little bit further. We leaned into Paul. He wrote a letter to Ephesus in Ephesians 5 and verse 21. He talks about this idea of submit to one another out of reverence for Christ, out of worship for Jesus. We submit to one another. And so in part two, we talked about this relationship should be a submission competition, a race to the back of the line, putting the other person's hopes, dreams, and desires even ahead of our own, that it should be mutual submission. And then last week, Peter gave us permission that sometimes there are times when you got to get the dishes out of the cupboard and you got to slam those bad boys up against the wall. There are times when you need to pull your phone out of your pocket and you just need to hurl it at somebody, just chunk it at them. Sometimes there are times when you must throw things, but not that way. And so Peter leans into it. If you missed any of these, especially if this last one, please don't take it out of context. I don't want to hear, hey, Pastor Daniel gave me permission, now all of our dishes are broken, okay, all right? So watch last week's sermon, watch any of these that you missed. You can see them on YouTube. You can see them on our Facebook channel. If you missed any of these, I hope that they're valuable. Today we're concluding. We're in part 4. We're concluding, and we're going to talk about this idea that there is a choice to be made, that we make a choice, that every person in every relationship, every single day makes a choice, that happy couples make a choice. And so for you and I, sometimes this choice will feel maybe like there wasn't really a choice to be made anyways. Maybe it feels a little bit more like a reaction to some circumstances. It feels a little bit like it's just a subconscious thing. And so happiness is a choice. I'm going to argue this today. Paul, from the Bible, is going to present this to us today. That inside of our relationship, this happiness that we long for and sometimes expect someone else to make it come to pass, happiness is actually a choice on our part, and that choice makes all of the difference. And so my goal for today is to consider this choice, to think about this choice, and maybe, just maybe, that we might be better equipped to make better choices as we move forward in our relationship. So if we want to experience happily ever after, it boils down to, it leans into a choice. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And what we're going to use is a very famous passage of Scripture. We're going to go into the New Testament. We're going to go into a place that when you got married, if you're married, that you might have had this read in your wedding. You might have actually, when you were crafting your vows, you might have borrowed from this language and integrated it into your wedding vows. We're going to go and talk about 1 Corinthians chapter 13. It's the love chapter. It's branded, right? And so this has so much depth, so much richness to it, so much context to it. And inside of this, we're going to just plow through several verses today, and then we're going to lean into one idea, one place that seems like maybe it just doesn't fit with the rest of it. And so I want to talk about that today. So let me give you a little bit of the context of what was happening in Corinth with Corinthians. And so as I've said already, the Apostle Paul, he wrote letters, right? He wrote a lot of the New Testament and the New Testament epistles. He wrote multiple letters to this city called Corinth in this first century audience. So today we view it and we look at it from our culture, our perspective. You got to rewind that thing and go and say, okay, what was happening during that day and time? So Paul writes a couple letters. Actually, scholars believe that he had written 3 letters and that we have 2 of them, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, but there's references to what seems to be, just trivia for you, what seems to be a 3rd letter that we believe that was lost somewhere in time. We have 2 of them. They show up in your Bible. 1 Corinthians, this one, what was happening in this time in Corinth, again, the first century audience, context of relationships here. So where they were, they had so many other cultures that were around them and that influenced them. And in that time, in that culture, when Jesus shows up and then the resurrection, as we'll celebrate next weekend with Easter, then the resurrection takes place and then Jesus is gone. And now you have a group of people who had been completely pagan in their history. In that culture around them, they believed in many gods. You know Greek mythology. Right? And so even in the Roman place, there was a god for everything under the sun, including the sun. There were a lot of false gods during that time. And so Paul comes on, and he's having to address this to people who were not Jewish. They didn't have the same background, the same upbringing. He's having to address a group of Gentiles, not Jews, who were familiar with all of these other gods. And now Paul is having to write a letter. And so throughout these first chapters, he's been talking about this idea that this one God, this one true God, he's actually very different from any of the other gods that you've experienced. He's different in the way that with the gods that you knew, it wasn't so much about this ethical thing. It wasn't about morality. It wasn't about how you and I would treat each other, Mike. It was more about this idea that we could just appease God. It wasn't about relationship. It wasn't horizontal in nature. It was just about trying to appease God. And maybe you know a little bit of religious history, some of the things that they would do that was awful, it was detestable. I mean, they would have temple prostitutes, they would sell themselves, and that was one of the means that they could appease God. Another thing that they would do, and this is terrible, is they would sacrifice people. When they felt like the gods were angry or they were upset or they were bitter or something was being held against them, they would even sacrifice children. And so again, it wasn't about this relationship here. And then Paul comes on the scene and says, oh, no, I've got to fix your framework here. I got to help you with your theology, all the ways that you had been thinking. And so in first century context here, he says there's only one God. There's one true God, one living God. All of the others are false gods. And he cares so much about relationships that pleasing God can be boiled down to how you and I treat one another, how we love one another. And so when Paul is leaning into 1 Corinthians 13, it shows up in all of our weddings, but this is really how we do life together. And so when we talk about community here, we talk about the value of doing life with one another, of loving one another, of serving one another. It leans into this idea that God himself, if we want to know how we care for God, how we respond to God, you can ultimately boil it down to how we treat one another. And Paul is going to lay out this argument that we are to love one another. And so here we are in 1 Corinthians 13. Again, a very, very familiar passage of Scripture. We're going to flow through the first 5-6 verses together, and then we're going to lean into some ideas. We're going to borrow some ideas here and talk about how it applies not just to peer-to-peer relationship, but our romantic relationships as well. So let's pick up in verse 1 of chapter 13 here, okay? So he says, if I speak in the tongues or the languages of men or of angels, but I do not have love. Can you say that with me? Have love. I'm going to need your help on this today, okay? He says, if I do not what? have love. If I do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. Listen, if I can speak, and I'm a great orator, a great communicator, if I can do all of those things, but it's not wrapped in love, then I'm just making a bunch of noise, right? When I read something like this as a communicator, I say, you know what? For me, this serves as a caution. And for you, this should also serve as a caution. When you hear pastors talk or someone who's delivering, communicating, in the day of the internet, you can watch everybody under the sun, and maybe they're an excellent communicator. Their skill sets are just so sharp. You're just leaning into every moment with them. Maybe they're very charismatic in their presentation. This right here just serves as a bit of caution. Communication can be a skill set. It can be a learned behavior. It can be refined over time. If you want to know me, you want to know who I am and what I'm about, then what you need to do is kind of press in and get up close. You need to see how I treat other people. You need to ask my wife, how does he treat you? You need to look at how I treat my children. Communication can be a skill set. We can learn all of these things, but if it is not wrapped in love, then it equates to nothing. It's just a bunch of noise. And so he gives us this bit of caution here. In verse 2, he says, if I have the gift of prophecy and I can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have faith that can move mountains, but I do not have love, I am nothing. He says, even if I have all of the wisdom, if I know the Bible through and through, I just am overflowing with knowledge, if I can answer any question that you have, if I'm like Solomon and I have wisdom and I can point you in the right direction, if I can do all of those things, but I have not love, this is very literal, is I am nothing, I equal nothing. And he, again, leans into this idea of having love. And so sometimes when we are impressed by knowledge, but the measure of maturity is never how much is in here. It's never even how much Bible that you know. It's how we love, how we live out the truth that we find in the Bible. The measure of maturity is not knowledge, it's heart. And so again, he goes on in verse 3 here. He says, if I give all that I possess, not just some offering every once in a while, not 10%, not 20%, not 50%. He says, if I give everything I own, and not just the material things that I own, if I even give my body so that I might boast, if I give these things to the poor so that I might boast, but I don't have love, then I have nothing. I am nothing. So if I'm giving to get, then I have nothing. And so he just repeatedly, over and over again, he uses this little two-word phrase here, having love. But what does he mean? What is he talking about here? What does this mean to have love? And so if I were to, in this room, if I were to poll you and I would say, you know what, raise your hand today if you have love. Majority of you, most of you, I would probably say I have love. I have love. Yeah, of course I have love. Who doesn't have love? I have love. I have love. I have compassion on people. I have empathy for someone. I love my family. I have love. But again, I would say that because this is written to a first century audience, the context of this written to a first century, I would say that these people would probably respond the same way to the same survey. Yeah, I have love. I have love. I have love. And if that's the case, then it would go without saying, why would Paul even put this in Scripture? So what does he mean about it? Where is the tension? Where is the gap between the love that he's talking about and sometimes the way that we process this is it's this internal thing. It's this emotional response that you and I have. I feel love in my heart. But Paul's going to come along and he's going to start to talk about what it means to have love here, and he's going to begin to define it in ways that are very, very practical. He's going to define it in very actionable terms, things that we actually do, things that love actually does. And so let's look together in verse 4. Here's what he says. He says, love is patient. Okay, get ready. This is wedding vow stuff right here. This is where it shows up. This is what you probably have printed out and posted in your bathroom somewhere. This is that piece of the Scripture that we've probably all seen a bazillion times. He says, love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. he goes through and he says, you know what? Love waits on the one another. It's not demanding. Love actually treats you the way that God treats me. I'm going to treat you that way. It does not envy. It's not jealous. When all the attention's on you, all the affection is going to you, you're the life of the party. I'm not jealous. I'm not trying to tear you down. Like, it's not envy, right? And it says that it does not boast. It's not bragging about itself. You've met those people, like, right? You tell a story and you get to the end of that story. You can tell they're not even waiting for you to finish. They're trying to jump in there. They're trying to one-up you, right? Oh, that's a good story. But wait till I tell you it's boasting. Love doesn't do that. It's not proud. It's not full of arrogance and ego. Love is not those things. He continues going in verse 5 here. He says, love does not dishonor others. It's not something that if I'm going to tear you down, if it doesn't build you up or edify you or encourage you, if it's going to bring you down, then love says, I actually avoid that. Love does not dishonor others. It's not self-seeking. It's not selfish in nature. And this is a real challenge. Even this is a challenge for me, just being honest with you. Our selfish nature, our selfish tendencies within relationship try to show up all the time, right? And constantly trying to push that down. It's not about me. How do I make it about her, my spouse, my wife? How do I make it about others? Love is not self-seeking. It's not easily angered. This was one I struggled with for a while too. How do you get that temper under control? If it's responding out of a place of anger and it just wells up in that moment, man, love is not present. It's not there. It's not happening that way. And so it says it keeps no records of wrongs. And how many of you, this one's tough too, how many of you would love to be in a relationship that wasn't like, you remember it was June 13th, 1989, and you did, and they bring it all back, right? There's this great file on you now, right? And so love says it doesn't do that. It doesn't keep a record of wrong. It doesn't just turn a blind eye, but it's not creating some file looking to bring this up again anytime you've upset me or you've angered me or we are in disagreement. Love doesn't do that. He says in verse 6, he says, love does not delight in evil, but rejoices in the truth. And we're going to come back to this one as we wrap this up today. So Paul's list, it's very, very actionable. We think of love as an emotional response to something, but Paul puts actionable words behind it. And in just a moment, the next place that we're going, he's going to give even a further list of actionable words. And he's going to pair some ideas together. And when he does this, when he pairs this next, this is the place whenever I look at it and I'm like, man, one of these, it doesn't seem like it fits with the other one. I've read this a bazillion times, but it doesn't seem like it belongs with the other one. So before we get there, I want to play a little game with you, okay? We're gonna kind of treat it like, are you smarter than a fifth grader? We're going to take you grade school kind of deal. In fact, on the way here to church this morning, I tested these on my first grader and my third grader, and they passed it. So I have high hopes for you today that you're going to pass this pop quiz as well. So you may remember in grade school where we did something called verbal classification. You probably don't remember this. I had to Google it. I asked my wife, who's a teacher. She didn't know the name of it. So there it is. What you did with verbal classifications is they would give you a list of words, sometimes 3, 4, 5 words, and what you would have to do is you would have to pick out the one word that doesn't seem to fit in the context. You remember this now, okay? I see your heads nodding with me. Awesome. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to do some verbal classifications together. I'm going to give you a handful of them. Pop quiz, right? You didn't come in expecting this today. We're going to see and test your knowledge. Are you smarter than my first or third grader, okay? So don't let me down here, all right? Here's how we're going to do it. I'm going to put the words on the screen, and when the words come up, I'll read them aloud to you. You're going to figure it out in your head. Don't say it out loud yet. And then I'll invite you on the count of 3, 1, 2, 3, and then you just kind of, get it out there, okay? All right, you ready? Everybody got the idea? Here's the first list of words. Verbal classification. Which word does not belong? Which word is not like the others? Mayor, lawyer, governor, senator. Okay, you got it? High hopes for you. On the count of 3, 1, 2, 3. Okay, you did pretty good. Okay, so why is this one? I'm not going to embarrass you. I heard somebody shout out the wrong answer. I'm not going to embarrass you, okay? So what is it? B is the right answer, okay? Man, I passed the first one. Great, good. You're doing a great job, okay? 100% so far. What is it about lawyer in this list that doesn't fit with the other ones? Okay, that's too many. Governing structure. Yeah, good. Look, she's doing fantastic with that. All right, awesome. Okay, let me give you the second one, all right? What? Oh, my goodness. This is a man who thinks outside of the box. Props to you. Yeah. Props to you, my man. All right, here we go. The second one, let's see what they look like. All right, here we go. English majors, you'll love this one. Noun, preposition, punctuation, or adverb. You got it? On the count of three, get ready. 1, 2, 3. Punctuation. Awesome. Nathaniel, did you know that one? Okay, why? What was the reason? Why is it different? Okay, it's not a word. Okay, let's have conversations with your mother after this. So they're parts of speech, right? And so punctuation is something that happens within a sentence, but these are all parts of speech, right? Okay, so let's go to the third one. Here we go. Which one is not like the others? Which one doesn't belong? Book, index, glossary, or chapter. Okay, you're getting the hang of this. I see it on your eyes. You're ready to jump. You're at the bit right here. On the count of three, okay? 1, 2, 3. Book. I think that was unanimous. Okay. All right, who's brave enough to raise their hand and tell me why it doesn't fit? Okay, you coughed, so you did this. You're up, man. Why doesn't this fit? Very good. So these are all parts of the book and not the book itself. Okay, good. All right, I think we have one or two more. Okay, here we go. Two more. All right, let's do them quickly. Tire, steering wheel, engine, or car. Okay, here we go. On the count of three. 1, 2, 3. Car. Good, and you know the reason for this one. You got that one. Okay, let's go to the last one. Here we go. All right. Guitar, flute, violin, or cello. On the count of three. 1, 2, 3. Flute. Flute. Why was it flute, Brad? Not a string instrument. Excellent. I love all of you named Brad in the room responding to that. Congratulations. You are now smarter than a fifth grader. Man, I knew you guys were a bright group of people. So here's what's happening, right? So Paul, in just a moment, is going to give us a list like this. And you may look at it and say, you know what, Pastor Daniel, it doesn't even make sense. These all fit together. When I look at this, and I'll show you why, and maybe you'll borrow from my idea here for a moment. When I look at this list that's about to be on screen here in just a moment, when I look at it, there's one of them that doesn't seem to fit like the others fit. And I'll tell you why. Here's the list. He says, Paul, he says, love always protects, always trusts, it always hopes, and it always perseveres. And when I look at this list, I struggle with one of them and putting them in the context of the other ones. When I look at this list, I see that all of them but one is my responsibility. It's on the part of the lover, while one of them seems to be contingent. It seems to be the responsibility of the lovee in the relationship. And so let's just go through them together. I can, even if the other person is in the wrong, I can still muster it up within me to protect and fight for the relationship. I'm responsible. This, even when things aren't going well, I can choose to struggle through and to press through for the relationship. You can probably see I'm narrowing it down. Hope is something that is within me, but this one, I struggle with this one because, again, all of the other ones seemed like something that I should be responsible for, but when I think about the idea of trust, I get that somewhere it's on the inside of me, but your behavior, the way that you respond, the way that you act, the things that you do, it really kind of makes this one almost like it doesn't belong with the other ones because it seems like it's the responsibility of someone else. And yet, when we go through this, and when it talks about this idea of always trusting, here's what it looks like in the definition of it. Love always trusts, Paul says. And it literally means to always believe. It means it believes everything, and it means that it defaults to trust. It leans into trust. And can I just be real with you? When I read this, I think, you know what? Whoever always trusts is one gullible, individual. Whoever always believes everything, do you know what happens with them? They're just naive. And it's a struggle inside of the heart. And we read this and we frame it and we make it so romantic, but the reality is that trust, as Paul is going to argue inside of it, while it feels like if I just constantly believe what you're doing and it's contingent on me and not on you, it feels like that I'm the one who is gullible and I'm the one who is naive. And Paul is going to make the argument. He's going to set this up and says, this idea that I'm talking about right here, this idea of trust and always trusting is the foundation on which everything in your relationship is built on. It's the foundation for love, to have depth of love, to experience happily ever after in your marriage, in your relationships, even peer to peer. Trust must be present. It must exist in that moment. And so it's the foundation of trust. And what I want to do is I want to kind of illustrate something for you. Okay, and a number of years ago, I was listening to this podcast, a pastor named Andy Stanley. Many of you have heard of Andy Stanley. He pastors a church, North Point in Atlanta, phenomenal guy. He also speaks in leadership circles, and whether it's business or in church leadership. And so I was listening to a podcast a number of years ago, and the illustration and the analogy that he set up in that moment, it changed me in the way that I deal with relationships really forever. And because of that, it's a language that we have adopted with our leadership team here at this church and with our volunteer team, our serve team. Maybe you're a part of this. We use this idea, this language borrowed from Andy Stanley about trust versus suspicion. Trust versus suspicion. And it is profound in nature. I can't get into all of that today. Maybe you want to Google it and look it up yourself. But here's the basic premise of something here, okay? So in my relationships, in every relationship, at some point in time, I have expectation. We've been talking about those expectations. And every time, in every relationship, there is a place when there exists a gap between what I expect and what I experience. There is a gap that exists between these two things. He said he was going to do. She promised she was going to do, but it did not happen that way, and I've had a different experience. And now there's a gap in the relationship, and every single time that there is a gap between what they've said and what they've done, we place something in that gap. Every single time we place something inside of that gap. And so we can do one of two things when that gap exists. We can choose to believe the best. You know what? I don't have all of the information right now. Right now, it seems like, man, they told me one thing and something else is happening. It seems like it's this one way, but you know what? In this moment, what I'm going to place in the gap is I'm going to lean into, I'm going to believe the best about the other individual. We're talking about trust. Or, option two, and many of us lean into this one, is that we come to a place where we do this, where we assume the worst. We can either believe the best or we can assume the worst. You know what? It's just like him. It's just like her. Here we are again. They said it was going to be different this time. And now we're here again. And I've just started to believe that this is just who they are. This is what's going to happen. And so now this gap has a lot of pain that's associated with it, has a lot of disappointment that's associated with it. It has unmet expectations that are associated with it. And now, because I'm assuming the worst, this relationship dynamic has completely evolved into something different. And now this sits. And so each of us, when we are talking about this illustration, we choose. It is a choice that we make every single time when there is a gap between what I expect and what I experience. Here comes the choice. And it doesn't often feel like a choice. It oftentimes feels like I'm just reacting to the circumstance. They're proving this about themselves. And I'm just responding in this way, and I'm assuming the worst. But we have the ability, we can make the choice here to believe the best. And so it's a choice. And happy couples, happily ever after couples, people who experience this in their life, they have a happy habit. Happiness, as I said up in the beginning, is a choice that you and I make. Happiness, there's a happy habit that we choose to believe the best about someone else, that love always trusts. And while to me it feels a little bit gullible sometimes, to me it feels a little bit like, whoa, am I just being naive here? Happy couples have a happy habit. And I want to just further lean into something here, another illustration. So there's this guy named Marcus Buckingham, and Marcus Buckingham is a guy, I don't know if he's a believer or not a believer, but his point in his book that he wrote, he's a leadership guy, leadership guru, he's a business consultant, he spends a lot of time doing research and then providing that research to the top 100, Fortune 100 lists of companies. He's that guy, he spends time in that network, okay? So in this book right here, one thing you need to know, Marcus goes into this where they're doing this study, and they're trying to find out what is the common denominator, what is the thing that runs through every relationship that leads to happily ever after. How do couples fall in love and stay in love for the long run? And he finds, through this research, he discovers a principle that really just supports what Paul has been telling us. So let me set it up a little bit more and tell you about this study. So he and a group of his researchers, his colleagues, they embark on a 20-year study. And over the course of 20 years, they study numerous relationships, all different races and black, white, yellow, green, purple, all different socioeconomic backgrounds, all different incomes from different parts of the world. There's nothing in common in those things. It is varied and it is vast in this research. And so they're studying these couples and the qualifications for being in this research. And this is great. The qualification of being a part of this study was not that you were in it for the long run. Maybe we've got kids together and we're going to stick this out. We're not going to get divorced because we've got kids together. It wasn't the idea that, you know what, it makes financial sense for us to stay together in relationship. It wasn't that either. The parameters, the requirements of you being in the study, in these thousands of couples that were studied over 20 years, for you to be in that, there had to be something in you that says, you know what, we've been married a while, we've gone through some things, and we still love each other. We still got it, baby. There had to be something that glued them together. And so they embark on this 20-year study, and let me tell you what they did. Just like most research, it begins with a hypothesis. It begins with an assumption about it. And this is what they assumed. They assumed, before they started interviewing and studying these people, they assumed that happy couples, people who experience happily ever after, they assumed that what happened is that once they got married and there was unmet expectations in the relationship, what they assumed was that people actually lowered their standards. They dumbed it down. They simplified it. What they assumed was, you know what? He's not all that I thought he was going to be. And she's not all that I thought she was going to be. And so they assumed that they would actually lower their standards and they would come to these places of compromise in their relationship. And because they had figured out how to compromise and they could lower their standard, then they could actually have longevity in their relationship and they were experiencing happily ever after. That's the assumption. And in 20 years of research, they were proved absolutely wrong. In 20 years of research, here's what they began to do. They began to pose these questions, same questions to a husband and a wife, to the partners, to the spouses in the relationship, and they would pose these questions to one another, and what they would do is they would ask them, and then they would wait, and they would hear the response, and they expected it to go a certain way, and then the responses revealed something about human nature. It revealed something about these happily ever after couples. It revealed that in those moments when they were asked these questions that they were pretty critical of themselves. And maybe you're like that too. You think about your own shortcomings, you're pretty critical of yourself. And in those moments, when they asked the same question about their spouse, there was this unrealistic response. They graded their partner way higher than the partner graded themselves. And they found this true throughout all of their studies. No matter where the people were, what they'd come from, what their background was, they found this to be true in all of those relationships. And so these people had an unrealistic view of their partner. And it kind of reinforces the cliche idea. Love is blind. Love is actually blind. And there's research in this study, and I wish I could just Man, pages and pages and pages of this stuff. I wish I could just give it all to you. In this research, as they're digging through here, they had come to this place, and they begin to define it, and they'd come to label it something that was called an upward spiral of love. And so it'll be here on the screen. They had come to this place where they realized that because of their unrealistic expectations, their unrealistic views, their illusions that they had about the other person, he's the best, she's the best, this illusion, it wasn't the reality. People graded themselves probably fairly accurately as they were going through, but the partner looked and says, you know what? I believe the best. I see the best. This illusion, it creates this conviction within them. And the longer they believed it, the longer they believed, you know what? He is the best. She is the best. The longer that they had this conviction leads to this place of security. And security, it equals trust in your relationship. And that's the word here. And so security inside of this relationship, I believe the best, I believe they're the best inside of this relationship. Now I have a conviction, it's leading to this place of security. And security, because I can trust you, we can now have intimacy. In fact, when this intimacy here, in order for intimacy to be inside of your relationship, it's as simply, intimacy is saying, I'm allowing you to know me. There's no pretenses, there's no mask, there's no facade. I trust you to the level, I'm secure enough with you that we can have a real, vulnerable intimacy, right? And so this security creates this and fosters this intimacy, and ultimately intimacy, what it does is the love begins to grow on the inside of it. And they found this true through every study, through every couple, that those that were happy, this is what they did. It began here with this idea, this illusion, this unrealistic view of them, of their partner, and it ultimately lands down to where intimacy creates more love. And then the beautiful thing that this love, it creates this spiral, it creates this circle. Guess what it does? It circles back to the top here. And so now this love is actually reinforcing this conviction, and it just repeats itself. So here's the conclusion. Here's the research conclusion. And this is powerful, and this is what Paul is saying to us here. This is the research conclusion. Happy couples find the most generous explanation for each other's behavior, and then they choose to believe it. Happy couples, they find the most generous explanation for each other's behaviors, and then they make a conscious decision to choose to believe it. Every time there's a gap between the expectation and what we experience, there is a choice that must be made. In happy couples, as all of the research backed up, as Paul points out, happy couples choose trust in those moments. They assume the best about each other. And so love always trusts. It always believes. It defaults to trust. But what about when it happens over and over again? What about when the same issue just keeps coming up? Okay, I chose to believe them the first time, and now we're back here again. What do we do in that? Listen, I know that when we're talking about this, there's some tension around the idea. I don't want to be gullible. I don't want to make myself just naive to something. I don't want to be repeatedly hurt. You don't want that either. And when Paul's saying that it's a choice that you and I make, that it's really not just contingent on the other person, it's a decision. I understand that there are some obstacles to our trust. I get it. There are some obstacles to our trust. So let's just take a couple minutes and let's talk about a couple of them, okay? And we could spend a lot of time right here. People spend years in counseling around these ideas that we're going to bring up. The first obstacle to trust is present experiences. You know what? Here we are again. Here's the expectation, here's the promise, here's what they said. They told me they were going to deliver. It was going to be different this time. He said, she said, but no, that's not the way that it went. And now here we are again. Present experiences make it difficult for me to trust the other person in the relationship. Past experiences, another obstacle to our trust. Past experiences also make it really difficult to trust people in relationships. And I just want to take you through. If you're a parent in the room, you'll get this, or you're just thinking about the psychology of kids. When a kid is young and they have their parents, they trust by default. They trust by default. Distrust is actually a learned behavior. They go through life, and at some point in time, somebody hurts them or wounds them or offends them in such a way in which that trust has been breached, it's been fractured, and now they've learned to not trust. And so over time, our experiences, our past experiences impact us this way. The reality is none of us walked into relationship with one another. None of us walked into a relationship without something already written on our past, written on our history. That we all come into it carrying these past experiences. And these experiences sometimes, unfortunately, sometimes they feel a little bit like baggage. They feel a little bit like wounds. They are wounds. And maybe it was one at a more surface level of our relationships. Maybe it was a past wound. Maybe it was a boss that you served and you thought that you could trust them, that you thought they had your back, and then they just hung you out to dry. Something didn't go right, and they blamed you for it. Trust was broken in that moment. Maybe, and I hear this often, maybe you had some breach of trust in your relationship with a church, where church hurt, church wounds, maybe a pastor that you had put yourself up underneath. Maybe at some level you were trusting them, and for some reason something happened, and your trust with them was breached in that moment, and now it feels like a wound or a dagger on the inside of your heart. Maybe for you, where it was as a child, your father or your mother was supposed to be there in a place, they were supposed to do certain things, and they abandoned you, and now abandonment goes along this idea of distrust. Maybe it was that you had a boyfriend, maybe you had a girlfriend, maybe you were in a marriage relationship and they broke your trust by cheating on you. Maybe that happened. And so what happens inside of our relationship is that we carry these things with us. Our past experiences make it difficult to do what Paul is telling us to do, to always trust, to choose to trust. It's a difficult thing to do. There's tension around this. And so these certain behaviors, now we're in a relationship and we've carried these things with us. And there are certain things that if we didn't have these past struggles, these past experiences, there are certain things that would just be dismissed, they would be looked over. But because of these past experiences, now we get triggered. Now certain behaviors, certain actions, certain things that they do, they remind us. They give us flashbacks into something that happened in our past, and now it presents itself, and insecurities begin to rise up within us, especially if somebody ever betrayed you, like they cheated on you or something like that. This one shows up. And so trust becomes very, very difficult. There's obstacles to our trust through our past experiences of this. So let's do this. Let's circle back. Here's what I want to do. I want to go back, and I want to talk about trust as a choice. That happiness through trust is a choice. And I want to go back to 1 Corinthians 13, and I want to look at verse 6, and I want to look at some of the ones that we just flew by earlier, and we'll wrap this all up together, okay? So here's what we're saying in verse 6. Here's what it says. We read this earlier. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. And so now as we read this, I want to talk just from the perspective of trust. I understand he's speaking to multiple things, but I want to look at it through the lens of trust in this moment. And so when it says to us, love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth, the reality is when trust is in this place, we don't go rejoicing over catching someone in their mistakes. We don't just lean into this idea where we would simply just assume the worst. When we assume the worst, we're constantly looking for that thing. We're on guard. We're watching for it. And guess what happens? It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You begin to find the thing that you were so fearful of, and you begin to look at it so intently that all of the behaviors, even the other person in the relationship, is now tiptoeing around you. And they're tiptoeing around your insecurities because you're not extending trust to them, and you're going to find what you're looking for. Ultimately, they can't live up to it. And so it becomes a weight and it becomes a burden on top of them. When there's not trust in the relationship, when it's been fractured, when it's been breached, whether from the present or from the past, love is not as rich as what God designed it to be. And I would even argue in those moments that love is not present. Paul says that love always trusts. Love always trusts. It's not building a case against one another. It's not trying to keep score. He says in verse 7, love always protects. It says, I'm going to protect myself, this relationship, against places of distrust. I'm going to protect this relationship because I know the ramifications. I know what's going to happen if trust is not present. And so I need to protect this relationship from breaches of trust. Love always trusts. It leans into trust. He goes on to say, love always hopes. You can go to the next one. Love is optimistic. It's not pessimistic. Love makes the optimistic choice, doesn't it? Love says, you know what? I am going to believe the best, regardless of how many times it's happened. I'm going to believe the best about them in this moment. Love always hopes. It always perseveres. It's determined, despite everything that's happened, despite all of the reasons that I might have for not having trust in this moment, despite those things, I'm going to persevere. I'm going to push through. I'm going to fight for trust inside of our relationship because I truly believe that without trust, that there's no love in that moment. And so I'm going to persevere. I'm going to press through. So love determines to always trust. So let me wrap this up. Let me bring this all to a head together. And let me just ask some questions, okay? How do you respond? Do you believe the best, or do you assume the worst? When there's a gap between what you expect, what was told, what was promised, what was committed to, and what you experience, what do you default to? Where do you go? Do you lean into trust, or do you become suspicious in that moment? Are you defined by suspicion? Are you constantly looking for that thing because there's a gap, because there's a lack of trust? Are you looking, oh, I caught you. Oh, there it is. I'm looking for it. Love keeps no record of those things. That it is your choice every single time. It's your choice every single time. And I know this idea does create tensions. I have my own tensions with it. I get it. And so hear me on this. What I'm not saying to you is that you remain naive or that you're gullible. What I'm not saying to you is that you just ignore it. You know what? I'm just going to believe the best. I'm going to believe the best. I'm going to hope for the best. One day it's just going to change. Right now, they're not doing what they said they were going to do. One day it's going to change. One day it's going to be different. It doesn't go the gullible route. Love in that moment, in fact, trust versus suspicion. When I'm feeling suspicion about something that's happening, let me kind of just give you some framework of what to do. You must talk about it. You cannot allow it to go unaddressed. You cannot allow it to sit down within you. When there is a gap here that happens, you must sit down and have the conversation. Trust versus suspicion says that when I'm feeling suspicious about something, I'm going to do the difficult thing, and we're going to sit down and we're going to have conversation. But you are going to come from this position of believing the best. I'm going to make some general assumptions about you. And so it looks like this. Babe, I realize that I probably don't have all of the information. I know that we said, or you said that you were going to do this. And I realize in this moment, I just don't have all of the information. I'm assuming the best here. I'm believing the best. Help me understand. Great words for you to adopt and implement into your conflict in your places when there's not trust. Help me understand. Sitting down, eyeball to eyeball. I don't assume I have all of the information. I haven't already leaned into assuming the worst. I'm not already on the defensive, but you said it was going to go this way. You said, and you didn't do, and now I'm attacking. And now I've put them in defensive position. If you want to experience happily ever after inside of your relationships, then you lean into this idea of believing the best. I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt. I know it didn't go the way we said, but help me understand. We do the difficult thing and we talk about it. We don't remain gullible, but you believe the best as long as you can simply believe the best, as long as you possibly can. And here's here's the important thing, and this is tough. When love keeps no records of wrongs, after that conversation is over, I have to go back to believing the best. I have to then kind of wipe the slate clean. And this is where forgiveness comes into the story, isn't it? I can't keep a record of all those wrongdoings and use them as ammo. I've got an arsenal of things built up, and you just wait. I'm about to... I that's not what love does. Love believes the best. It has the difficult conversation. It assumes the best of the other person. And maybe that's not your thing. Maybe you can't do that. Maybe you say, Pastor Daniel, you know what? That's too difficult because of my present experiences or my past experience. Let me tell you what the other option is. Let me tell you what option B is. Here it is. Option B is the opposite of everything Paul said. It delights in uncovering mistakes. Oh, I got you right there. It thrives on speculation. It's energized by speculation. It assumes the worst and it embraces doubt. Our only other option to trust inside of our relationship, our alternative to the foundation of relationship, if you desire to have intimacy the way that God designed it to be, if you desire to have a relationship with another person in which it leads to a happily ever after, not we're just sticking this thing out, but because our relationship is built around this idea that I will trust you. And because I can trust you, I can be intimate with you. And because I'm intimate with you, our love can grow in the relationship. And sometimes love simply has a blind eye about it, doesn't it? Love always trusts. Let's pray together. Father, as we conclude this series where we talk about happily ever after over the last several weeks, God, I hope that as we've looked at your word, that it's resonating within us, that it's stirring something within us. And God, that through your word, God, that relationships, whether they're romantic relationships or they're peer-to-peer relationships, that relationships would be strengthened. The measure of maturity for a believer is that we are defined by our love, how we serve one another. God, would you help us to love one another well? God, that we would put others' hopes, dreams, and desires above our own, that we would choose to submit to one another, that when it comes places of tension and turmoil, God, that we would choose to throw those things on you, that we would turn to you in those moments rather than throwing them at our partner or other people in the relationships. And God, as we've talked about today, would you help us to experience a level of trust that allows us to be vulnerable with one another, that leads to intimacy and reinforces the love that we have. God, when it is tense, when it seems like they've just done it again, when it seems like we should just not forgive them, when we should hold it against them, could you remind us of how you treat us? That you don't keep a record of wrongdoings. You require us to have conversation. God, forgive me of my sin. Forgive me for my wrongdoings. Forgive me for where I've broken trust you. You require conversation of us, but when that happens, you wipe the slate clean, and you are the model. God, it's so difficult for us to do that. Would you help us in our hearts? Would you help us, Jesus? We thank you for that. Father, again, I just pray for the marriages and the relationships in the room, whether their spouse is represented here or not. God, that you would strengthen the bond between them. God, that you would be the center, as we sang earlier, that Jesus would be the center of it all, that you would be the center of our marriages inside of our church, that we would celebrate 100-year anniversaries here at City Church. And God, that where enemy tries to raise its head or divorce seems the best option, in that moment that you would come rushing in and that you would allow us to be reminded of how you forgave and how you healed. God, you be the center of it. And again, with every head bowed and every eye closed, if you're in this room and you think, okay, relationships are the last thing on my mind in this moment. Right now, my life just seems like it is just lost or it is away from God. Today, I want to remind you, as I said earlier, that Jesus himself, he invites us into a trust relationship with him, that it simply begins with conversation of saying, God, here I am again for the bazillionth time, and I'm bringing it back to you again. I know there's been a gap, but Lord, here I am. Forgive me. Make me new. Wash me clean. God, don't hold it against me. And your Father in heaven, he's so faithful in those moments that if you would do that, then he comes rushing alongside you. Bible says he makes us new again, that his mercies are for us. And so if you're here in the house today and you need that from God, I would invite you to just have conversation with God, pray with God, talk to your Father in heaven. He loves you, he adores you, he is for you and not against you. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.